January 14th, 1945. Camp Concordia, north central Kansas. The prairie air outside was knife cold, but inside the recreation hall, the 35mm projector threw a hot cone of light through the cigarette haze and dust, the sprockets ticking like a well-kept MG-34. Oberleutnant Karl Mertens, Afrika Korps, coat still stamped PW, stood in line with 80 other Germans, each handed a small punched cardboard ticket by an American sergeant who might as well have been a cinema usher back in Bremen. On the wall, a garish poster of two grinning comic cowboys, nothing like the stiff Kulturfilme Goebbels had approved. An MP with an M1 carbine leaned on the back wall, bored. "You'll like this one. Abbott and Costello." The camp interpreter, PFC Bill Yates, whispered in serviceable German. "It's Sunday. Everybody gets a laugh." The projector whirred to life. A Western slapstick filled the screen. Americans and Germans laughed at the same pratfall. Mertens, who had spliced newsreels at UFA as a teenager, felt the floor tilt. This was the enemy, and they were showing him jokes. "Das ist erlaubt," he muttered. "Sure is, Lieutenant," Yates said. "This is America. If you live for these hidden front stories, stick around and tell me where you're listening from." The reel clicked forward. Light and laughter sealed the room 7 weeks earlier, on the troop train to Kansas. The train slowed under a sky the color of rifle metal, prairie wind hissing through gaps in the wooden cars. When the doors were rolled back, Oberleutnant Karl Mertens blinked at the flat Kansas winter, stubbled fields, a line of guard towers, and beyond them, a sprawl of low tar-papered buildings surrounded by double runs of barbed wire and a curved-top gate marked simply PW Camp. It was bigger than any dulag he had seen, and tidier. American MPs in wool overcoats and steel M1 helmets waited with slung carbines, stamping their boots against the cold. They called orders in English, then in accented German. "Ausrücken! 5 Mann pro Reihe." Mertens adjusted the captured issue overcoat that now carried a black PW stencil and stepped down first, not to provoke, just to be seen. Officers had to be visible. Behind him, men from his Tunis column filed out, eyes tracking the guard towers. The air smelled of coal smoke and something domestic, stew maybe, coming from inside the compound. That, more than the rifles, disoriented him. A prison that cooked. They were marched past a headquarters hut flying the U.S. flag, past a neat infirmary, to an open square where a captain with a clipboard read off camp rules. Work details under Geneva, mail 3 times monthly, recreation on Sundays, no clustering at the fence. An interpreter repeated it in quick Berlin German. Mertens noted the phrasing, "You will be treated the same as our own troops." He'd heard it on the ship, but assumed it was shipboard politeness. Here, it was posted on a board. At the far end of the square, out of place among mess halls and barracks, stood a building with shuttered windows and a hand-painted sign, Recreation Hall, program posted Friday. On a smaller placard, someone had written, in English and then German, "Film, Sunday 1930. His stride faltered. A film? For prisoners. They were led to Barracks 12A, bunks stacked and blankets folded in hospital corners. Inside, another German already held court. Feldwebel Erich Brandt, broad-shouldered, North African sun still in his face. He greeted Mertens with the barest nod. "Herr Oberleutnant," Brandt said, "they run this like a school. You'll see." Mertens set his kit on an upper bunk and, through the frosted window, looked back toward the recreation hall. The wind rattled the tar paper. Americans, he thought, were wasting good film on enemies. Or else they were so certain of themselves they could afford to be generous. Either way, he would have to find out which. The barracks stove had burned low, giving off that sweet oily smell of American coal when the interpreter came through doing his evening circuit. PFC. William Bill Yates wore the same olive drab as the guards, but no carbine, just a notebook tucked into his belt. His German carried the flat vowels of the upper Midwest. "Leute," he said, tapping the doorframe. "Sunday night, film again. Same rules. Tickets from the orderly room tomorrow." He started to move on, then saw Mertens at the table, writing in a small black notebook the camp clerk had issued. "You're the Oberleutnant from Tunis," Yates said in German. "You looked at the hall like you knew projectors." Mertens kept his tone even. "As a boy, I worked reels at Ufa in Bremen. Long time ago." "That's so." Yates brightened, the way Americans did without calculation. "Ours is Army issue, 35 millimeter. Sergeant Collins runs it, but he's cavalry, not pictures. You can sit up front Sunday if you like." From the upper bunk, Brandt snorted. "Next, they will ask you to sell popcorn for them." Yates heard, but ignored it. "It's regulation, you know," he added for Mertens' benefit. "Geneva says you get recreation. We just use what the town has. Westerns, funny stuff, nothing sneaky." Nothing sneaky, yet a whole enemy hall laughed together in the dark. Mertens closed the notebook. "Why comedies?" he asked. "Why not newsreels, instructional films?" "Because it's Sunday," Yates said, as if that settled the matter. "Americans go to church, eat, then go laugh. We figured you might like to see something besides the wire." Brandt swung his legs over the side of the bunk. "We do not need to be entertained by the enemy," he said in German, loud enough for the room. A couple of POWs glanced up from cards. Mertens felt the eyes. An officer could not be seen craving enemy comforts, but the offer was precise. Front, seats, a look at the machine. It appealed to the old technician in him more than to the prisoner. "I will attend," he said at last. "To observe." Yates nodded, satisfied. "Then get your ticket early. They run out." When the interpreter left, the room settled again. Outside, the wind pushed snow dust against the window. Mertens imagined the dark hall, the lamp, the beam through dust. Whatever the Americans thought they were doing, he needed to see it done. Sunday night, the hall filled early. POWs handed over their small punched tickets to a bored GI at the door and filed into rows of wooden folding chairs. The stove in the corner glowed red, throwing off enough heat that the windows fogged. Up on the platform, Sergeant Collins bent over the army projector, threading the leader through guides and sprockets. The machine gave off that hot metal, ozone smell Mertens remembered from Bremen. Yates spotted him and tapped the front row. "Here, Lieutenant, you can see the frame lines." Mertens sat, back straight, cap in his lap. Behind him he felt, rather than saw, Brandt's presence, 3 rows back, among the men who wanted to show they were attending only because it was allowed. 2 MPs stood at the rear, carbines slung, caps pushed back. This was unmistakably permitted. The hall lights dimmed. A hush fell, punctuated by a cough, chair scrape. Then the lamp flared, and a black and white cowboy title card filled the sheet tacked to the wall. Not a newsreel, not an instruction. A cheap Western with comic business. An American audience would have relaxed at once. At first, Mertens watched technically. The steadiness of the frame. The small jitter where the projector gate wasn't perfectly aligned. The grain of a print that had made the rounds of Kansas. Dialogue in English washed over him. Yates leaned in occasionally, murmuring German glosses on punchlines. Then came the gag. The clumsy deputy, boots too big, trying to mount a horse that kept sidestepping. The timing was clean, character-specific, physical rather than verbal, international. The horse moved sideways just as the deputy committed his weight, and he sprawled, hat flying. The room erupted. Americans at the back, Germans in front, laughter rolling forward like heat. And before he could armor himself, Mertens laughed too, sharp, involuntary, the laugh of someone who recognized craft. He heard Brant's laughter stop. Mertens closed his mouth, swallowed, eyes back on the screen. But the damage was done. He had shared a rhythm with the enemy. He began watching the room instead, the relaxed faces of guards, the way one POW wiped his eyes, the easy democracy of it. When the reel ended and the house lights snapped back on, dust drifting in the cone above the projector, men stood talking about actors' names they half caught. Mertens took out his notebook, almost without thinking, and jotted 2. Abbott, Costello, spelled as best he could. On his way out, he felt a hand close over his arm. Brant's voice was low, for him alone. "So," the Feldwebel said, "America is funny now?" The barracks door thumped shut behind them, and the warm, crowded smell of wool, boot grease, and coal swallowed the night air. Men were already peeling off greatcoats, talking over one another about the horse gag. Brant waited until Mertens had set his cap on the bunk rail, then stepped into the narrow aisle between bunks so everyone could hear. "So," he said, voice level, "an Oberleutnant of the German army finds American clowns amusing." A few heads turned. No one wanted to miss officers arguing. Mertens stayed seated to look unruffled. "I find their equipment interesting," he said. "The projector, the print, the way they organize leisure even in a prison. It tells us how they think." "It tells us," Brant shot back, "that they want us to forget we are prisoners. That is how you make a dog docile. You let it lie by the stove." A younger POW on the lower bunk muttered, "But it was funny," then fell silent when Brant's gaze flicked to him. Mertens folded his hands. "You know I worked with film before the war. Propaganda is never just what is on the screen. It's the system around it. Who's allowed in, who hands the tickets, who stands at the back with a rifle and still laughs. Did you see the MPs? They were relaxed. That means this kind of treatment is normal for them. That is worth noting." "So you laughed to take notes?" Brant said. There was a thin smile now. He thought he had him. "I laugh," Mertens said carefully, "because I understood the timing. And because I wanted to see if the guards would object. They did not. That is information, Feldwebel. We were taught to study the enemy, were we not?" Silence, then a few nods. Framed that way, observation, not enjoyment, it sounded like officer business. Brant didn't like it, but he couldn't call an officer's curiosity treason. He shifted tactics. "Just remember," he said to the room, "there are camps where men have been beaten for less. We maintain discipline ourselves, or we lose respect." At that moment, the door opened again, and an American corporal stuck his head in, breath steaming. "Detail list posted," he said in slow German. "Tomorrow. Farm work. Minnesota detachment. Check names." Eyes went to the board by the door. A change of routine always rippled through a camp. Mertens rose to look, coat over his arm. Whatever storm Brant meant to build here would have to wait. The Americans were moving men north. They loaded them before dawn, when Kansas was only a line of orange on the prairie. The POWs, overcoats buttoned to the throat, clambered into a pair of worn passenger cars coupled behind a freight consist. MPs with white helmet bands walked the platform, checking names against the Minnesota detachment list. Breath smoked from every mouth. The boards of the platform were rimmed with frost. Mertens handed over his name. The sergeant checked, nodded him through. He had expected to feel only annoyance. He had just learned the rhythm of Concordia, the Sunday films, the chemistry of his barracks. Now he was being sent north like cargo. Inside, the car was bare-boned but heated. Benches down each side, duffels underfoot. As the train lurched into motion, men settled into blankets, some already dozing. Out the window, the camp shrank, the fence lines and guard towers receding into flat land. Kansas gave way, over hours, to country with more trees. More snow caught in the fence posts. At a stop, somewhere in Nebraska, the door banged open and an American in an OD overcoat and knit cap climbed aboard with two MPs. "Interpreter joining you," the corporal called. The newcomer pulled off his gloves and Mertens recognized the square, open face. "Lieutenant," Yates grinned, switching to German. "You didn't think I'd let you have all the northern air, did you?" "You are from there," Mertens said, more relieved than he wanted to show. "Yep. They like to stick me on the farm crews this time of year. Guys up there don't like paperwork." He dropped onto the bench opposite. Same rules, work day, back to camp at night. Smaller place than Kansas, but decent cook, and he leaned forward a little. They run pictures too. The town shares prints. You'll feel at home. At home. The phrase was wrong, but the idea of another dim hall in the middle of snow country, another beam of light, steadied him. If different camps showed the same things American civilians saw, then these films weren't a special weapon for prisoners. They were America revealing itself, absent swagger. The train clattered north through falling snow. Mertens watched the white fields slide by and began to wonder what a Minnesota winter comedy night looked like, and what, this time, the Americans wanted him to see. The Minnesota camp was hardly more than a fenced rectangle beside a farm road. Half a dozen tar-papered huts, a mess, a guard shack. Snow banked against the wire, and dead cornfields ran away in all directions. On Sunday night, they turned the mess into a theater. Benches dragged into rows, blackout curtains over the windows, projector tables set near the stove. Outside, the wind moaned. Inside, it smelled of wet wool and coffee. Mertens took a seat where Yates had pointed, far enough forward to see the frame, not so far as to look eager. This time, there were not only POWs, but two American civilians, likely from the farm, stamped boots in the doorway, curious to watch the enemy watch. An MP dimmed the lamps. The projector coughed, caught, and the beam carved through the dust. No comic titles. Instead, a sober main card, an Army distribution header, English only. The first images were of a town square with American flags, women, in coats, schoolchildren, no ruins, no ration lines. A narrator, calm, middle-aged, spoke of what we fight for. The camera lingered on a public library, on a polling place, on factory workers of different backgrounds filing out together. It was not the blunt anti-Nazi stuff he half expected. It was lifestyle, normality, soft power on celluloid. He felt himself shift from watching to reading. There was a rhythm to the cuts, busy street, friendly faces, democratic ritual, soldiers returning to ordinary neighborhoods, even in wartime. He had seen the same grammar in UFA productions, only pointed the other way. Here the argument was, our abundance is unshaken, our institutions are open, and we can even show this to prisoners. A POW behind him grumbled, propaganda. Another whispered, at least in America the girls have shoes. Mertens kept his face blank. Inside, he marked the choices. No shots of politicians, no overt boasting. Just the insinuation that this was the baseline. He could almost hear the staff in Washington. Show them the country, not the slogans. When the lights came up, snow light leaked around the curtain edges. Yates was watching him. Different from the cowboy, huh? It is constructed, Mertens said. Sure, Yates shrugged. So was yours. That stung because it was correct. Walking back to the hut, boots crunching on packed snow, Mertens understood the earlier laughter in Kansas had not been an accident. It was step one. Now came step two. He would have to put that in a letter, carefully. The letter from Kansas arrived folded twice and stamped in purple by the camp censor. The American corporal handed it over during noon roll call. From your other place, he said in English. Snow blew past in little dry veils. Inside the hut, with the stove ticking and men dozing after lunch, Mertens opened it carefully so the brittle paper wouldn't tear. Brandt's handwriting was heavy, impatient. Oberleutnant, we hear you are being shown American entertainment in the North also. Be careful. Their plan is clear. Soften, divide, make some men prefer them. Some of ours here refused last Sunday. Better to give up a film than give up dignity. When you return, we will need officers who did not let themselves be used. No insults, but there was a test in it. Mertens looked at the purple censor mark again. The Americans had read this too. If he answered in the same register, warning of softening, his reply might never leave Minnesota. He pulled his own notebook from his coat pocket. On one page, he had already written Abbott, Costello, Cowboy Film, Kansas, and beneath that, from last night, documentary, polls, library, mixed workers, Minnesota. He stared at the list a moment, then added almost sheepishly, Ginger Rogers, Cary Grant, names he'd heard POWs in Kansas whisper about from earlier reels. He drafted in pencil, Feldwebel. The Americans here follow Geneva strictly. Films seem to be standard recreation, not special for us. Material varies. Some of it is useful to understand their civil life. I attend to observe their methods. There is nothing here that compels loyalty to them. He paused. Too bland, the censors would let it pass, but Brandt would hear the hedging. He added one more line. It is better to know what the enemy considers normal than to guess at it. That, at least, sounded like an officer. Outside, boots crunched. Yates doing his rounds with the mailbag. Mertens folded the letter, slid it into the provided envelope, and addressed it to Camp Concordia. As he sealed it, he glanced again at his notebook page of American names. If anyone asked, he could claim he was building a file. In truth, he didn't want to forget the way the Minnesota film had made winter disappear for 20 minutes. He handed the envelope to Yates at the door. Nothing political, he said in German. Yates smiled. Then it flies. It started with empty benches. On the next Sunday, the mess-turned-theater didn't fill the way it had. The stove still glowed. The projector still waited on its table. Snow still hissed against the shutters, but a whole row of Germans stayed in their hut, card playing loud enough for the guard on duty to hear. The two local Americans came anyway, stamping snow from their boots, and looked puzzled at the gaps. The camp sergeant counted heads, frowned, and afterward caught Yates and Mertens together near the pot-bellied stove. If they don't want it, he said, jerking a thumb toward the hall, we can save the gasoline in the prints. Ain't no regulation says we gotta run a theater. Yates glanced at Mertens, a question in it. This was what Brandt's letter had forecast. Refusal to prove hardness. If the Americans shut the projector down, the only window he had into their civilian pulse would vanish. If some of them object to the material, Mertens said carefully in English, allow me to speak with them first. It is better if a German tells them to behave. The sergeant scratched his jaw. Long as it's quiet, we don't need any kraut politics up here. In the hut, the boycott group sat around a crate, smoke hanging low. Their spokesman was an older NCO from Saxony, not as forceful as Brandt, but repeating the same argument. Today it is libraries and elections. Tomorrow it is Hitler's crimes. They will make us clap for it. They will show it whether we sit or not, Mertens said. And if we do not sit, they will take the whole thing away. Then you will have proven nothing except that you can sit in the cold. We don't need American amusements. No, Mertens agreed. We need American habits. To see how they live so well, they can spare film for prisoners. You think that is weakness. I tell you, it is confidence. A few men looked down. They, too, had felt that confidence in the dark. They're watching the numbers, Mertens added. If attendance is poor again, they will stop. Then, when they finally show what you fear, you will have no say in how your men receive it. That was the hook, control. Slowly, resentfully, the NCO nodded. "One more Sunday," he said. "But if it is filth, then you can say you saw it," Merton said, "and so can I." Outside, the wind rose. In the guard shack, the sergeant called the command post to say the Germans would attend next week. The projector, for now, was safe. They knew it would be different the moment they saw the real can. It wasn't the battered town print the sergeant usually brought from the exchange. This one came in a plain Army metal case with a typed slip, delivered straight to the projector table by a jeep from the nearest post. The MP in charge signed for it. No civilians were let in this time. Snow rattled against the mess hall walls as the POWs filed in. Some of the boycotters from last week came grudgingly, coats still on, ready to leave at the first insult. Mertens took his now customary place near the front. Yates stood off to the side, arms folded, his face more serious than usual. The lights went down. The projector started, louder than before. No cheerful music, no main title. The first frame, a European street reduced to rubble, a church spire cracked, then bodies being carried on stretchers past Allied soldiers. The narrator spoke terse English. Dates, locations, advances. Germany was retreating everywhere. Behind him, a man cursed under his breath. Another said, "Lies," too quickly. The reel did not stop at ruins. It cut to wire, to barracks more primitive than any in Kansas, to faces too thin. Not the full horror. This was early yet, but enough to show prisoners in striped clothing, to show civilians staring, to show, unmistakably, German uniforms among the guards. A bench scraped. 2 POWs stood up. The rear MP's voice cracked out of the dark. "Sit down. You were told to attend." One sat. The other hovered, fists balled, then sat too. The beam never wavered. Mertens watched and felt the old Kansas laughter ghost across his mind. The horse gag, the shared joke. The same path of light, the same dust motes. Only now it carried accusation. He found himself analyzing edit points, as if by naming the technique he could lessen the blow. But whoever cut this knew what they were doing. Ruins, prisoners, German insignia, Allied medical care. An argument without a single spoken accusation. When the lights came up, no one moved. Breath smoked in the cold hall. Outside, the wind keened. Mertens stayed seated a moment longer than the rest to make it clear, to the Americans, to the men behind him, and maybe to himself, that he had seen all of it. The Kansas wind hadn't changed. It still came hard across the flat, carrying dust and the smell of livestock from somewhere beyond the wire. But when Mertens stepped off the truck, back into Camp Concordia, the place felt smaller. After the stripped-down Minnesota detachment, this was almost comfortable. More barracks, bigger mess, the familiar recreation hall with the hand-lettered Film Sunday 1930. Word of his return ran ahead of him. By evening he found Brandt in Barracks 12A, polishing boots as if the desert sand still clung to them. The Feldwebel looked up, eyes sharp. "So," Brandt said, "you watched it." "I did." "All of it?" "All of it." Other men paused in their chores, listening. Brandt straightened. "Then you saw how they mean to shame us, and you sat like a schoolboy." Mertens took his time unbuttoning his overcoat, letting the warmth of the stove soak in after the truck ride. "They meant to show us," he said, "that they can do both. Laughter and accusation on the same machine. That is precisely why we should refuse." "No," Mertens said, more firmly than he'd intended. "That is why we should see. A country that can afford to let its enemies laugh on Sunday and then show them their defeats the next week. That country is not afraid." He looked around the barracks, at the men half turned toward him. This is America. They are so sure they will win that they are already rehearsing normal life. The phrase landed. A few POWs exchanged glances. They had felt that same assurance in the dark hall. Brandt's mouth thinned. You begin to sound like them? I sound like someone who wants to know what the world will be when we get out from behind this wire, Merton said. You asked for officers who had not let themselves be used. I tell you, I have not. I have watched. I can tell you how they cut their films, how they speak to civilians while at war. Can you? The challenge hung there. For a moment, Mertens thought Brandt might push it to blows. Such things had happened in other camps, but the Feldwebel only shoved his boots aside and stood. Then you explain it to them on Sunday, he said, when they laugh again. I will, Mertens said. Outside, across the yard, he could see through the recreation hall window as an American sergeant tested the projector, the cone of light bright even in late afternoon. The same machine, the same dust, now carrying everything he had seen up north. By March, the war news on the camp bulletin board had turned from setbacks to collapses. Bridgeheads, encirclements, cities whose names none of the Kansas farmers could pronounce. Each new sheet the Americans tacked up took a little air out of the barracks. Men sat longer on their bunks after evening roll call, staring at nothing. Mertens waited for those lulls, then took out his black notebook. He sat at the small table by the window, where the last prairie light came in thin and brown through the glass. From his pocket, he produced the thing he'd kept tucked in his paybook since January, a creased, hole-punch ticket from the first Kansas comedy night. It was trivial, printed on cheap card, English on one side, the camp stamp on the other. He flattened it between the pages with care. On the facing page he wrote, in neat German script, Kansas cowboy comedy, two-man act, Abbott Costello. Guards laughed. Projector steady. Minnesota, civic, democratic real. Purpose, normalization. Minnesota, late. European destruction, prisoners. Purpose, confrontation. He paused, tapping the pencil. Outside, he could hear the distant whir of the projector in the recreation hall. Tonight, it was some frontier picture for the men who still wanted distraction. A month ago, he would have been there. Tonight, he wanted to fix things on paper before they blurred. Behind him, a corporal from Bremen, younger, slumped onto the opposite bunk. How can you write now, the man said dully, when they are bombing our cities flat? Because someone will have to remember how the enemy behaved, Mertens said without looking up. Not only how he fought. The younger man made a skeptical sound but didn't argue. Weariness had dulled the urge. Mertens added another line. American leisure is part of their war. They do not suspend pleasure. He thought of Yeats's offhand line, It's Sunday, everybody gets a laugh, and underlined the sentence. Then, almost as an afterthought, he sketched two ovals, quick profiles. One the broad-nosed sergeant who ran the projector, the other the sharp-featured comic from the Kansas reel, as he remembered him frozen mid-fall. He did it not because drawing was allowed, though it was within reason, but because he wanted to carry their faces out of the wire. When he shut the notebook, the ticket made a soft, final sound. A thing kept, a thing to open later in a country that might not know anymore what Americans looked like in 1945. By late spring, the notices went up in English first, then in German. Processing for return to Europe would begin as transport became available. Not tomorrow, not next week, but soon. Men read the sheets and began to talk about Bremen, about Saxony, about ruins. Some grew restless, some quiet. The wire was suddenly temporary. That Sunday, the recreation hall filled again, more than usual, as if wordless agreement had gone round that if this was the last stretch in Kansas, they would see what the Americans wanted them to see. The same hall as in January. Wooden chairs, stove ticking, dust in the beam. Outside, prairie wind. Inside, an army sergeant checking the reel. This time it was a newsreel. Europe in May colors. Allied columns rolling through German towns. Crowds cheering in Paris. Flags everywhere. A narrator in that confident American baritone talked of victory, rebuilding, the responsibilities of free nations. There was no place for them in the images except as captives in the background of surrender shots. Some Germans shifted in their seats. One man stared at his boots. Another's jaw tightened when Hamburg flashed past, ruins where his street might have been. But the projector kept running. The reel did what all the others had done. It placed America at the center of an ordered, generous world. Even in triumph, they made time to show school kids waving, women working, GIs skating on a frozen pond somewhere, leisure braided into war. When the lights came up, an American at the back clapped once, twice. A couple of his buddies joined him. It was not gloating. It was habit. This is how you end a show. Mertens, still seated near the front, raised his hands and gave two small, deliberate applauses. Not loud enough to lead, just enough that anyone watching could see he had watched to the end. No one told him to stop. No German hissed. The moment passed. He stood, buttoned his PW-marked coat, and slipped his black notebook back inside. In it was the punch ticket from the first Kansas comedy, pressed flat. In his head was Yates's line, "This is America," now enlarged. Not just the laughter, but the authority to make an enemy sit in the dark and see. Outside, beyond the hall's warm light, the barbed wire still caught the last of the sun. Soon he would roll past it on a truck, then a train, then a ship. But wherever he ended up, Bremen in rubble, or some camp in Britain while they sorted papers, he would know that once, in the middle of a war, the United States had shown him its face on a white sheet and invited him, impossibly, to laugh.